There is a time unlike any other, hidden in the folds of night, where the world holds its breath and the heavens lean close. It is a moment shrouded in shadows, wrapped in silence, and yet filled with divine mystery. That moment is 3 a.m. Not merely a time on the clock, but a spiritual signpost, an hour known to the watchmen, to the prophets, to those who lie awake while the rest of the world sleeps. It is the moment when darkness reaches its peak, when the night is at its deepest, and when the soul feels most alone. And yet, paradoxically, it is also the hour of the greatest expectancy, because God often waits for the darkest hour to do his most profound work. Throughout the ages, this hour has been known as the turning point. In the natural, it is often the coldest time of the night, when the body grows most tired and the mind most vulnerable. But in the spiritual realm, 3 a.m. marks something sacred. It is the hour between what was and what will be, a time when the cries of the desperate rise like incense and heaven hears with open ears. It is no coincidence that many intercessors and prophetic voices are awakened at this very hour. Why? Because 3 a.m. is a portal in time, when the veil between the temporal and the eternal is thin, and the voice of God is near. This is the hour when the enemy believes he has won, when he thinks the light has been extinguished and that silence equals victory. But it is also the hour when God begins to move in silence. Just as the enemy settles into false triumph, the Spirit of God stirs. The heavens begin to rumble, not with noise, but with destiny. The reason it feels so heavy at this time is because spiritual war is raging. It's not just tiredness that weighs on you, it's the pressure of something about to break. The atmosphere is thick, not just with sleep, but with divine intention. It is the moment when the seed in the soil, hidden and forgotten, begins to crack open under the pressure of unseen growth. It is the breaking point where everything feels lost, and yet it's the very moment when heaven says, now. In the scriptures, again and again, God chooses the darkest moments to bring about his brightest light. Think of the children of Israel in Egypt, when the final plague was unleashed and the angel of death passed over. That moment took place not in daylight, but in the stillness of the night. It was not when Pharaoh was watching, but when he was sleeping. Deliverance came while others were dreaming. The transition from bondage to freedom began in the depths of night. Consider the disciples in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. The waves crashed and the wind howled and fear gripped their hearts. But it was in the fourth watch of the night, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., that Jesus came walking on the water. He didn't arrive when it was safe or when the sun was shining. He came when terror was highest and hope was lowest. And yet, that is the moment he chose to reveal his authority over the storm. There's a reason why the ancient world recognized the significance of the midnight and third-hour watches. They understood that the deeper the night, the more powerful the encounter. It was at midnight that Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns from their prison cell, and the earth shook, not during the day, not in front of the crowds, but in the middle of the night, when no one expected anything to happen. God moved in power when the world had moved on. In our own lives, the 3 a.m. hour often appears in seasons, not just on the clock. It's the season when everything feels quiet, when prayers seem unanswered, when the promise looks buried. It's the time when discouragement knocks, when fear creeps in, and when hope seems to be fading. But that very stillness is the womb of the miracle. That silence is the canvas upon which God begins to write his next chapter. It is not the absence of God, but the positioning for his movement. There is something sacred about the tension of 3 a.m. when the night is darkest and yet the coming of the dawn is certain. God could choose to act at noon when the sun is high and faith is easy, but he often chooses the hour of shadows when the soul must cling to him by trust alone, because it is in the deepest night that faith becomes real. God does not move according to man's schedule. His timing is not set by clocks or calendars, but by covenant. He is the God who dwells outside of time and yet enters into it at precise appointed hours. And one of those sacred moments is when the world is cloaked in darkness, when the stillness is so deep it feels like eternity is brushing against time. That is the hour when God moves in the midnight. It is not always in the blaze of noon or in the bustle of the marketplace that his voice is heard or his hand revealed. More often, it is in the hidden hour, the overlooked moment, the time when all seems quiet and no one is watching. The movements of heaven are not always loud. They are often secret, and the most powerful shifts happen while the world sleeps. Scripture is full of patterns, and one of them is this: when man is at rest or has reached the end of his strength, God begins to act. The Red Sea did not part when the Israelites still had options. It opened when they had none. The angel didn't strike down the armies of Assyria when Jerusalem was confident, but when the city was trembling in fear during the night. The Lord didn't send deliverance to Gideon at midday, but in the stillness of night, after faith had been tested and the army reduced to a remnant. Over and over we see a rhythm. God waits for the moment when human effort is exhausted and the soul must look beyond itself In the book of Acts, Paul and Silas were not rescued after a public outcry or a protest. They were beaten, chained, and thrown into the innermost cell. No crowd surrounded them. No advocate stood outside the prison gates. And yet at midnight, when the city slept and their voices were the only sound rising in that dark place, God moved, not quietly, not symbolically, but in a shaking, a quake, a divine interruption that broke not only chains, but systems. The foundations of the prison trembled, and that shaking began in the night. There is a sacredness to the hidden hours. When man cannot see, God is still working. When man cannot hear, heaven is not silent. There is a divine strategy in waiting until the darkest moment. For in that darkness, the light cannot be missed. The night becomes the stage, the silence becomes the amplifier, and the absence becomes the proof of presence. If the miracle happened at noon, many would credit the light. If it happened in the crowd, many would credit the people. But when it happens at 3 a.m. when the room is empty, when no one is watching, then the glory is God's alone. Even in the life of Yeshua, the pattern holds. He prayed in the garden, not at dawn, but deep in the night, in agony as his disciples struggled to stay awake. His betrayal happened not under the sun, but under torches and shadows, and when he was crucified, darkness covered the land, even at midday. It was as if heaven marked the hour with a reversal of nature itself. But even after the cross, the breakthrough came in the early hours. The tomb was found empty, not in the middle of the day, but as the first light was breaking. Before the world awoke, before the noise returned, the greatest victory in history had already taken place. The stone was rolled away not for him to leave, but for us to see. When God moves in the midnight hour, it is not only a rescue, it is a revelation. He is revealing that he is not bound by time, by expectation, or by human plans. He is showing that his ways are higher and his moments are chosen for maximum glory. The very fact that he waits until the world is silent reveals that he desires intimacy, not just spectacle. He wants the soul to meet him in the quiet, to learn that power is not always in the fire, nor in the earthquake, but in the still small voice that comes when the noise has ceased. So often we ask why he delays, why he waits until the last hour, but in that waiting, he is working. In the silence, he is preparing, and in the midnight hour, he is arranging the convergence of all things so that when he does move, nothing and no one can take the credit. When the heavens open in the midnight, it is not only to answer prayer, but to fulfill prophecy. It is not only to deliver from trouble, but to declare his sovereignty. There is an hour when the noise of the world fades, when the voices of men grow quiet, and the distractions that fill the daylight hours fall away into stillness. It is in that hour, often overlooked and underestimated, that something sacred begins to stir. At 3 a.m., when cities are asleep and hearts are heavy, when anxiety whispers and silence lingers, God chooses to visit. This is not a visitation marked by thunder or earthquake, but by the presence that moves softly through the soul, like wind through the branches. It is a divine encounter, a holy visitation where God reveals what is hidden, speaks what has been silenced, and unlocks what has been sealed. This hour is not just a time on the clock. It is a spiritual threshold. It is the crossing between the night and the dawn, the boundary between what has been and what is about to come. It is the moment when the veil thins, when the eternal presses in close to the temporal, and heaven draws near to earth. In the natural, 3 a.m. is when sleep is deepest, when dreams reach their peak and the subconscious opens wide. But in the spirit, it is when revelation comes, not to the proud, but to the broken, not to the loud, but to the listening, not to the one surrounded by applause, but to the one crying out in the dark. God has always moved in the hidden places. He speaks in the wilderness, reveals in the cave, and anoints in the secret room. And so it is with the hour of visitation. It comes not when it is convenient, but when the soul is vulnerable, when the heart is open, raw, and willing to receive. Visitation is not entertainment, it is encounter. It is the moment when the living God steps into time, not for spectacle, but for transformation. And the 3 a.m. hour becomes the altar where the divine meets the desperate. This hour is the call to the watchman, the intercessor, the one who senses the stirring and rises from sleep to listen. It is no coincidence that in ancient times, the third watch of the night was considered the most spiritually charged. It was when soldiers were most weary, when cities were most vulnerable, and yet it was the hour Jacob wrestled with God and received both a blessing and a wound. It is the hour Samuel heard the voice calling in the sanctuary while Eli slept. It is the hour when visions are released, when dreams become messages, and when heaven touches the earth. There are things God will not say in the light of day because the crowd would distort it. There are truths he reserves for the hidden hour when there are no ears to impress, only hearts to transform. In the noise of day, revelation can become spectacle, but in the silence of 3 a.m., it becomes intimacy. He whispers not because he is distant, but because he is close. The whisper is for those leaning in, those who have left the comfort of sleep to find the face of the one they love. In this hour of visitation, God not only reveals himself, he reveals you. He uncovers what was buried beneath busyness, exposes the wounds that daylight hides, and brings to light the call that has been dormant. It is the hour of identity where Jacob becomes Israel, where Saul becomes Paul, where the overlooked are named and the broken are called. And it is also the hour of preparation. Before the sun rises, before the crowd gathers, God prepares He anoints them in private before he appoints them in public. He breaks them in secret so he can use them in power. He visits to shape, to refine, and to ignite. 3 a.m. is not only about what God says, it is about what he does. It is the hour when he gives dreams that carry destiny. It is the hour when he calls out the name of a prophet, when he reveals the next step, when he gives strength to carry what you could not carry the day before. It is when the oil flows in the hidden room, when the lamp of revelation is lit, and when the soul, once weary, begins to burn again with holy fire. Visitation is not always about deliverance. Sometimes it is about direction. Sometimes he does not remove the prison, but speaks purpose into it. Sometimes he does not silence the storm, but speaks within it. This sacred hour becomes the proving ground of faith, the threshing floor of calling, the upper room of encounter. God is not looking for the strongest or the loudest, but for the one who is awake in the silence, the one who says yes before the sun rises. Visitation does not come to the casual. It comes not when we demand, but when we yield. It comes not with warning, but with weight. And when it comes, everything begins to shift, not because circumstances immediately change, but because presence has entered the room. Breakthrough does not always come when we expect it. It does not arrive when everything makes sense, nor when the circumstances align neatly, nor when the strength of man can carry it. Breakthrough in the pattern of God often comes in moments wrapped in contradiction, when hope seems buried, when prayers seem unanswered, when the night is long and the soul is tired. It is the paradox of heaven that what we think is the end becomes the beginning, that what feels like silence is the preparation for a sound, and that the moment of greatest weakness becomes the hour of divine power. This is the mystery of 3 a.m., the hour when God births breakthrough not in the daylight, but in the darkness. There are times when the promises of God seem distant, when what was spoken over your life doesn't match the scene you find yourself in. There are nights when the vision looks more like a fading memory than a coming reality. And yet it is in those very moments that God moves. Not when the table is set, but when the cupboard is bare. Not when the crowd is cheering, but when you are alone. Because God is not restricted by what restricts us. He is not intimidated by closed doors, by sealed tombs, or by the ticking of the clock. He steps into impossibility as if it were a doorway and uses the unlikely as his signature. The breakthrough that comes at 3 a.m. is not by human force. It is by divine intervention. It is not a result of perfect planning, but of persistent faith. It comes not to those who are qualified by earthly standards, but to those who have been refined in hidden fires. It is often born in obscurity, cultivated in delay, and delivered in a moment that seems barren. Yet that moment, when nothing appears to be happening, is often the exact place where everything is shifting. The womb of the night holds the birth of the promise. What seems delayed is actually being developed. What looks empty is being prepared to be filled. The breakthrough is not always loud. Sometimes it comes in a whisper that silences the storm. Sometimes it comes in the form of a cracked door, a small sign, a quiet turn, but it is no less powerful for its subtlety. The people of Israel cried out for deliverance for generations. When it came, it did not come through an army, but through a baby placed in a basket. It did not begin in the palace, but in a desert, with a man whose best days seemed behind him. God sent the breakthrough not in a chariot, but through a shepherd with a staff, and he split the sea, not with a shout, but with an outstretched hand and a heart surrendered. At 3 a.m., we often find ourselves face to face with the reality of our limitations. It is the hour when the body is weak, the mind is vulnerable, and the spirit is either pressed down or lifted up. It is in that place that God releases what no man can manufacture. The jail cells that held Paul and Silas could not be broken by strength, but they fell when praise rose in the night. The shaking of the earth did not come at noon, but in the stillness of the watch. What had been locked was suddenly loose, not by force, but by presence. It is the presence of God that breaks chains, not the effort of men. So many breakthroughs in Scripture began with weariness. Elijah, under the broom tree praying for death, became the prophet of fire and rain. Hannah, weeping in the temple, gave birth to a prophet who anointed kings. The man at the pool of Bethesda, forgotten for decades, encountered the healer in a single moment and walked. All of them were visited in a place of emptiness, and all were changed by an encounter that came unexpectedly. God chooses the hour of impossibility because it glorifies him completely. When all options are gone, when the strength has run out, when the plan has failed, then the hand of God becomes undeniable. The midnight hour is not just a time, it is a test. It reveals whether the soul is tethered to circumstance or to covenant, whether faith is a feeling or a fire. And when the soul clings to God in that hour, breakthrough does not just change the situation, it changes the person. It turns prisoners into preachers, orphans into kings, wanderers into warriors. The moment that feels like nothing is happening is often the very place where everything is beginning. The 3 a.m. hour is the birthplace of reversal, the chamber of sudden shifts, the holy ground of new beginnings. What was denied in the light begins to open in the dark. What was stuck begins to breathe. Breakthrough does not come to confirm our plans, but to fulfill his purpose. And his purpose is never hindered by the night. There is a mystery in the patterns of God, a rhythm that moves against the expectations of man. He does not follow the calendar of kings or the strategies of empires. He does not bow to deadlines or consult human logic. He works according to Kairos, divine timing, appointed moments when heaven intersects earth and eternity steps into the present. And often those moments come when everything appears still, silent, and forgotten. The 3 a.m. hour is one of those moments where divine timing meets human waiting, where what God spoke in the beginning begins to take form in the night. It is easy to believe in the light when things are moving, when doors are opening, when prayers are answered with visible results. But the true test of faith is not the day, it is the night, when you have heard the promise but have not yet seen the fulfillment, when the vision feels delayed and the heart grows weary in the waiting. Yet that is the very ground where God works, not after the waiting, but in it. He is not only the God of answers, he is the God of timing, and his timing is perfect not because it is fast, but because it is right. When God called Abraham, he promised a son. But years passed and the promise seemed impossible. The natural cycles had ended, the body had withered, but God waited until the promise was beyond human ability to fulfill, so that when Isaac came, no one could boast. It wasn't the result of effort or strategy. It was the fulfillment of a word given and preserved through faith. And that word came to pass not in the light of logic, but in the night of impossibility. At the appointed time, not a moment before, not a moment after, God acted. There is power in divine delay. Though it does not feel like power, it feels like silence, like rejection, like loss. But in the unseen, the timing of God is setting all things into alignment. The heart that waits in faith is being formed, the path ahead is being cleared, and the people involved are being positioned. What feels like a denial is a divine setup. If God moved too soon, it would collapse under its own weight. If he moved too late, hope would fade. But he moves at 3 a.m. when it is dark enough to test and quiet enough to hear and holy enough to reveal. Divine timing is not about convenience, it's about completion. God waited 4 days before raising Lazarus, not because he was late, but because he wanted to reveal a deeper glory. He delayed not to punish, but to position, so that when the breakthrough came, it would not just be a healing, it would be a resurrection. There are prayers we have prayed that seem buried, forgotten, sealed behind a stone, but even sealed tombs cannot stop divine timing. When the appointed hour comes, the stone rolls away, and what was dead begins to rise, not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. At 3 a.m., most of the world is unaware, asleep, disengaged, but heaven is not. Angels are on assignment. Doors are being unlocked. Chains are being loosened. God is not bound by time, but he honors appointed times. He moves in rhythms established before the foundation of the world, and he brings to pass what he has spoken, not according to our urgency, but according to his sovereignty. Those who understand this do not panic in the delay. They worship, they wait, they watch, because they know the hour will come when the suddenly of God enters the timeline of man. The prophets often spoke of the fullness of time, a moment when prophecy would no longer just be spoken but fulfilled. That fullness is not random. It is the fruit of seasons. Seasons of sowing, of pressing, of pruning, and when the fullness comes, it often looks nothing like we imagined, because divine timing rarely matches human planning. It bypasses the familiar and touches the supernatural. It enters the night with fire and speaks in dreams. It turns a prison into a palace, a valley into a victory, a crisis into a calling. In the 3 a.m. hour, the soul has a choice: to fear the silence or to trust the timing, to retreat into doubt or press forward in faith. And those who trust the timing find themselves standing in the very place they once wept over. They see the promise fulfilled in ways they never expected, not because they were perfect, but because they refused to give up in the waiting. Divine timing does not rush, but it never fails. When it comes, it justifies every tear, every delay, every silent night, and it proves that God was never late. He was preparing the perfect hour. There is something about the night that reveals what the day cannot. In the brightness of the sun, many things are hidden by distraction, masked by motion, diluted by the noise of life. But in the silence of night, the soul begins to speak and the heavens begin to echo. At 3 a.m., the illusions of control dissolve, and what remains is what is eternal. It is in that hour that the masks fall off, the walls come down, and the true condition of the heart is revealed. It is also in that hour that God draws near, not with the fire of spectacle, but with the whisper of awakening. The 3 a.m. hour is not just a moment on a clock. It is a spiritual portal, a threshold where God does not just answer prayers. He awakens callings. He does not merely give solutions. He summons destiny. It is a moment where the Spirit stirs what has been lying dormant, breathing life into what has been buried beneath years of delay, disappointment, or fear. In the day, we function, but in the night, we confront. We confront the gap between who we are and who we're called to be, between what we've settled for and what we were born for. And in that confrontation, God does not shame. He awakens. The scriptures are full of these awakenings in the watches of the night. When Samuel lay down, it was in the night that he heard his name called. He did not know yet how to recognize the voice, but God was already speaking. He was awaking a prophet in the body of a boy. And the first call came not at noon, but at night. In the quiet, in the stillness, God placed a fire inside one who would carry his word to a nation. The awakening came before the recognition, and the voice came before the understanding. Because God does not awaken based on comprehension. He awakens based on calling. It was in the night that God awakened Jacob with a dream of a ladder reaching into heaven, with angels ascending and descending, and a covenant being renewed. Jacob was running, uncertain, full of fear, and yet God chose that moment to speak destiny. The ground he was lying on seemed ordinary, but heaven declared it holy, because when God awakens you, he also awakens the place where you are. A desert becomes a sanctuary. A pit becomes a platform. The place of rest becomes the place of revelation. That is what 3 a.m. does. It sanctifies the ordinary through divine presence. There is a fire that burns in the night that does not burn in the day. It is the fire of awakening that calls men and women out of complacency, out of slumber, out of survival. It is the voice that says, "Rise, for your light has come," even though darkness still surrounds. God does not wait for dawn to speak light. He speaks light into darkness. He calls the sleeper to awaken, not because the world is ready, but because heaven is moving. The 3 a.m. call is not for the faint-hearted. It is for the yielded, for those who dare to say yes in the dark, who obey before they see, who walk before the path is visible. This awakening is not always dramatic. Sometimes it comes in the form of unrest, of divine discontent, a stirring that cannot be explained, a sense that there is more, a burden that grows heavier as the world grows quieter. It is God knocking not on the door of your situation, but on the door of your soul. He is calling forth purpose that has been wrapped in delay, faith that has been smothered by fear, and identity that has been buried under survival. The call is not to strive, it is to awaken, to remember who you are, to remember who he is, to rise even when nothing around you has changed. When Jesus walked on water, it was in the night. When he came to the disciples in the storm, it was in the watches before dawn. Their fear had reached its peak, and then they saw him. And even then they did not recognize him right away. But the awakening was in motion. It was a call to trust what they could not see clearly, to step out when the winds were still raging. The night was not the problem. It was the proving ground. The place where faith is not just preached but lived, where the voice of God breaks through fear and calls forth a response that defies logic. At 3 a.m., you are not alone. Though it may feel like the whole world sleeps, heaven is fully awake. The throne is not empty. The Spirit is not silent. Angels are not idle. There is movement in the unseen realm. And what God awakens at 3 a.m. is not just for that moment. It is for your future. The cry that rises in that hour may not be answered with immediate change, but it is answered with eternal weight. Because the awakening that begins in the soul becomes the spark that sets generations ablaze.